Well, hello, and as the world waits with bated breath, expecting the new release of some packaged software that you're all running already, back at the Register, we're dealing with real things, specifically today, deploying voice over IP in real life, the stuff that's actually going to make your business run better, it's going to make your life easier, and might actually make your boss some money. So, my name's Tim Phillips from the Register, and with us today to talk about this, from our old mates at Freeform Dynamics, we have Josie Sefton. Hello, Josie.
Hi there, Tim.
First time in the studio today for Josie. It's quite nice here, isn't it? And also, the first time in the studio today from Thus, James Hone. Hello, James.
Hi, Tim.
Okay, now, I've got to take you through the interface before we get on with the meat and potatoes of the conversation. So, as you can see, you've got us and you've got the presentation. What we really want you to do is ask as many questions as possible, because while we've got these guys in the studio, it's good to pin them down and get them to answer the things that are on your mind. So make sure that you ask those questions. You can download the presentation to look at your leisure and give to your friends later. And also, there's a tab for feedback. We want to hear what you think of our webcasts, because we want to make Regcasts better than other webcasts, and we do that by taking note of what you tell us. You can also find out about our bios, and you can, well, let's get on with it, I guess. So, deploying voice over IP in real life. Josie, is this something that people are doing?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly there are more businesses doing voice over IP now than there were a few years ago. But that said, there are still actually quite a lot of companies that have yet to take the plunge into voice over IP. They're kind of skirting the edge of the party, deciding, shall we join, shan't we? And essentially, there are a couple of reasons for this hesitancy in actually going forward. The first is wrapped up with actually how to go about migrating to voice over IP. And companies are faced with a whole stack of questions like, how do we actually engage with the supplier, and which supplier should we go with, and also which solution is going to be right for our business. And from an internal perspective as well, what sort of things do we need to take into account? So businesses are faced with lots of questions, and actually some of them are very, very complex. Secondly, essentially what companies are dealing with is the issue of kind of stakeholder confidence in voice over IP. So you've got suppliers out there in the market telling a very good story about voice over IP and the benefits that are associated with it. But from a user perspective, the questions kind of come around, is it actually, when it's implemented in my business, what's it going to look like? Is it actually going to deliver against what those suppliers are saying? So with that in mind, we went out to the reg readers who had implemented voice over IP and asked them about their experience with the service, and had a look and see how closely that experience was matching what the suppliers were actually saying. And we got some really interesting feedback, which obviously I want to share today. But before I launch into that, it's probably worth just recapping what's actually driving this migration to voice over IP that we are increasingly seeing. Well, to begin with, it's a lot more trusted solution now than it was a few years ago. People understand what it's about, what it can deliver, and there aren't quite so many horror stories as there were a few years ago, and they're certainly not quite as scary as they were. In addition, people have a lot more choice in terms of what's available to them. There are a lot more suppliers out in the marketplace for starters, and there are more delivery options. And what that means is that voice over IP no longer is just the preserve of large enterprises with large capital expenditure budgets. It's really something that is available to all businesses, which is a really good thing.
Because, I mean, it's been a bit of a high-risk project for some IT departments, hasn't it? Because the idea of taking on what used to be done by the telephony people, and if it doesn't work, then you've got a disaster on your hands.
Absolutely, absolutely. But as I said, because things have moved on, suppliers haven't stood still in this regard. They've really addressed a lot of the issues that have underlined the early implementations and dealt with them, and shaped the delivery options as well. So it's it's a much more stable solution now than it was, and it's much less high risk.
But with that, I mean, I'll add that because there are so many players out there now, us included, it's a bit of a jungle for people. You know, hence the reason for this type of forum, because at the end of the day, if you're a buyer wanting to go out and buy voice over IP, where do you look first? And that, you know, for the suppliers is getting your voice heard, and for the buyer is actually which voice do I want to listen to in the first place? Because you know, there's so many different things to think about, aren't there?
Yes, I've got an idea what you're going to say to this, but a lot of people just say, well, I mean, voice over IP, it's all just the same. Everybody's more or less the same in the market. Do you agree with that?
No. I'll be absolutely frank.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure you're surprised to hear that. I think it's to do. There's a whole mix of factors involved in deploying voice over IP. You can do it in so many different ways, as Josie's just alluded to. And you know, just to narrow it down to a very basic example, do you deploy voice over IP over the internet, or do you do it over a private network? And then it comes up. Then you're in that situation where you're balancing price with performance. So there's that scenario that I think probably has to be in the forefront of people's minds, and obviously we'll go on to that later in this session.
Yeah, because you don't want to stumble over Josie's slides.
No, I don't.
No. Sorry, Josie, yeah.
And in point of fact, something that we'll touch on later is that all suppliers aren't the same, and that did actually come through quite strongly in some of the feedback, but I'll save that for later, of course. So actually, just to wrap up here, obviously there's a need to get costs down. It's not just economic climate that people are dealing with at the moment, but also comms costs are really kind of spiralling up in businesses, and there's a real pressure on businesses to actually rein them back, and voice over IP does perform in this area very well. And then of course there's the functionality aspect of voice over IP. So let's move on to the results. One thing that is very noticeable is that compared to the situation a couple of years ago, there has been a very marked shift away from public service type offerings with voice over IP to more business grade installations.
Explain to me what you mean by that. The public service is just doing it over the ordinary internet.
Just talking about things like Skype.
Right.
So businesses would dabble with Skype, and businesses do use Skype today for certain functions, without a doubt. But there's much more focus now on using things like hosted or hybrid services or premise-based solutions. So people obviously are treating voice over IP much more seriously, to the point that they're actually now prepared to invest in voice over IP as a solution for their business.
So the idea is perhaps a couple of years ago, they're at that stage of hearing about Skype, few people downloading it, maybe not even being particularly a project, just some people having an idea and having a go at it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And seems like they've decided they want something else.
Yes.
Okay.
And that comes through very, very nicely here, so that's a great client. So it's a very positive message for people who are actually thinking about it, and that's what we're trying to show. What are the messages that are coming out of this? Are they positive if you're thinking about going ahead with voice over IP or not? Okay, the issue of call quality is a pretty big one for businesses. You can't operate a business with substandard voice service. And unfortunately for VoIP, this is one of the areas where it has suffered, particularly over the past few years. And there's kind of numerous horror stories around this. What we have picked up on, that although things still aren't perfect, they are certainly getting better for a lot of users. So it's a much better scenario now for people, and this is really driven by, obviously, suppliers are focusing on the issue of call quality in a much more serious way. They know that users haven't been happy, so they have looked at implementing things like quality of service on services to make sure that the call quality aspect is addressed. And I've got some feedback that I'd like to pick up on this, because obviously we did get a lot of comments from Reg readers on the issue of call quality.
You did the poll, didn't you? Yeah.
We did the poll, and this is probably where we got the most feedback, and it was a real mixed bag of stuff. So we got one reg reader, for example, saying we're getting too many dropped calls and our provider has absolutely no idea why. And for us, that's not satisfactory as a business, and of course it's not. Another said, reliability has been a nightmare. Lots of dropped calls, lots of disconnections, lots of silent calls. Businesses can't operate with that, of course. And yet another, they were happy with features and the quality. Features are great, quality is fantastic, but reliability is a real disaster. Call dropouts are frequent, and in addition there's a huge dependence on power that our old system simply didn't have. So some not great things there. But that said, there were some good aspects as well coming out, some good comments. So one reader said it's a frighteningly great solution. I don't know what that means, but it's a frighteningly great solution that's exceeded our expectations. And another saying, we had worries about the quality of voice over IP, but our supplier dealt with it, implemented quality of service, and call quality has been fine. So there's some encouraging stories as well.
Well, let's just go quickly get some response from you, James, on that one. We've people there concerned about the very basic thing, call quality. Your customers saying the same to you?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. It's got to be down to, it's got to match TDM. There's no getting away from the fact that if it doesn't match TDM, then, because phone calls are still a vital communication artery, if you like, it's got to match that. So, in other words, it's up to the provider to decide how they want to deliver that voice over IP. Now, in my humble opinion, a private network is the best way to do that because you have control over that network and you can deliver those VoIP packets in a timely fashion, and you can meet jitter and latency type metrics as well.
But here's the thing, a couple of years ago then the voice over IP providers used to often say to me, well, the problem is our customers' networks just aren't up to it. You go back to your customers and tell them that?
No, I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to the provider to scale their network accordingly. Mm-hmm. So that's the core network. The customer network, exactly. It's all about the homework before you actually sell the solution, and it's actually determining what is already in place with that customer. Do they have the capacity? Because a lot of the time, there are service providers out there who will try and, sell the capacity as well, so that you never come across that problem. That's the thing. So that the whole thing is wrapped in this wrapper of capability, if you like, about yes, we can sell you the right amount of bandwidth because we know that's the right amount of bandwidth for your profile, if you like, of your call rates and your call traffic across the network. If you can get that right, then it should be fine. So from our point of view, we try and do that from day one. Make sure the capacity is already in place, and then worry about how you put the VoIP over it later.
Okay, thanks very much, Josie.
Okay, so kind of just to finish up here with the issue of call quality, the thing that really comes out here from a user perspective, from a business perspective, is call quality. It is something that can be dealt with, but just make sure that you have it in mind. It is a potential sticking area, so you have to obviously give it due attention.
It's going to drive your users crazy if they don't have call quality that they're used to.
And if they go crazy, they won't use it, and that's a simple message as well.
Yeah.
Okay, if we just kind of carry on with this theme of call quality. Now, when people aren't happy, when they're grumbling about their voice over IP usage, and by the way, just to point out here, we're not actually talking about a significant number of the people who responded to the poll. It's actually only a very small proportion of people who either weren't really that satisfied or who had actually just gone away from voice over IP altogether. But again, just to underline, when call quality, when there are problems, it tends to be the call quality issue, and it's a critical area for businesses at the end of the day, and it has to be right. And just to reiterate, if users aren't happy with the quality of their voice service, if they're on a business call, that call drops. If they're not happy with that, then they will simply try and use something else. They may pick up their mobile, and that's exactly what you don't want people to do.
But your costs are going to go through the roof if they start picking up their mobiles for sort of 2-hour conference calls that I gather you business people have these days. But it's again, this gets back into call quality, wraps up several different things. When we're talking about quality, what's the thing that people notice? We've got dropped calls, but are there other aspects to call quality that are likely to be. James,
well, you get distortion on the call, so in effect you get a kind of stuttering effect, if you like, and that can be a number of different things. But I go back to the capacity, and that tends to be the number one culprit in terms of if there isn't enough capacity in there in the first place, then the least you should be doing is prioritising that voice traffic over all the other types of traffic, so that at least you don't get that situation occurring.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Now, cost savings, this is where voice over IP really does come into its own. There's some fantastic stories to tell here. So, irrespective of whether the type of service that you have, irrespective of whether you're a large company or a small company, really what you can expect is pretty good cost savings. It depends on your call profile, obviously, but by and large there's some very, very respectable cost savings. And again, it's worth just picking up on some of the feedback from the Red readers here. So some readers were saying, massive cost savings. It paid for itself in 3 months, and it was mainly due to reduction in international call costs. Another comment was it's hard to quibble with a 50% cost reduction, which is pretty sizable actually, while adding more features. So that's one pretty happy user at the end of the day. And another said there's occasional hiccups with our voice over IP solution, but with 33% of the base cost of the old carrier, then the savings are most certainly worth it. So some really good stories coming out there.
At the bottom of your slide here, the hybrid doesn't have as good a results as the other three. Why not?
No, it doesn't. We didn't examine that in depth, but what we think there is there's probably some issues around how people are actually assessing the cost savings. That said, it's still there's still some good cost savings, and of course it depends on the type of hybrid solution. There could be an element of DIY in there. We just don't know.
James, do you provide something like a return on investment calculator? Are there tools about this sort of thing that you can use to help people decide how much money they're going to save?
There are tools. What we found, though, is that you can actually complicate things. So by restricting it to an ROI calculator, what we do is plainly say to them, what's going on with your line rental? How much is it per month? Because if you're looking at an ISDN 30 times 2, etc., £300, £500 a month is a significant outlay for that rental. So usually that's the single biggest argument to win over someone onto voice over IP. Of course, there are all these other considerations that we're talking about today, but that, from a cost-saving point of view, is huge.
Okay, now I see. I see also that when we're looking at this, we've got the cost savings seem to be, even though the satisfaction isn't so great with the public services, the cost saving seems to be pretty high on that as well. So maybe people aren't, people who aren't expecting very much, they're still pretty delighted. If they're driven by cost, they're still getting a good result off this as well, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you say, even just using public services, I've used public voice over IP services, and you accept that sometimes quality is not great, but the amount of money you save, it's fantastic.
Okay.
Okay. What jumps out from this slide is that the journey to voice over IP really isn't quite there yet. There are still some problems with transitioning. So you've got a quite significant chunk of people who are saying, yeah, it's actually been really smooth for us. It's been a great journey. We've had no problems at all. But there's an equally sizable chunk that are saying, yeah, it's okay, but it hasn't been as good as it should have been. It could have been better. And there's a not insignificant number that are saying it's been pretty bad for us. We didn't really enjoy it.
That's about 1 in 7 are saying it's been awful for them.
Yeah, it's been quite a lot, yeah. And again, I just want to pick up on a little bit of feedback that we got here. So one reader came back and said, if you can survive the first 2 to 4 weeks, now 2 to 4 weeks isn't actually quite a long time, I don't think, in voice over IP terms, but if you can survive the first 2 to 4 weeks of predictable pain in adopting voice over IP, you're going to definitely be sold once the bill arrives. Another said, hire a professional when moving to voice over IP, and that's actually feedback from somebody who thinks voice over IP is fantastic. Another said, our phone company didn't know enough about voice over IP. We should have used an IP networking company instead. And yet another was do some planning and then do a bit more planning and then finish it with some more planning and then add some planning on top of that. So the kind of streams that come out of that is plan for the transition. You know, there's a lot of things to think about from an internal perspective.
So one thing I was quite surprised at with that is that the phone company, I guess, you know, it's one thing to say that the phone company wants to protect its traditional business, but you're thinking by now at this level, this far into the voice over IP story, phone companies that want to have a business in 10 years should have the expertise now. Jen, I mean, I guess you'd be all in favour of going to, you know, IP networking specialists.
Yeah, I'm a bit biased, it has to be said. You know, traditional minutes on PSTN, you know, are still there. You know, we all realise we're going to have to move over to IP eventually. It will become, you know, the majority of the market. That's without a doubt. There are still companies out there that want to still sell minutes because, you know, for them there's reasonable margin in it. But, you know, at the end of the day, you can't ignore the benefits of voice over IP, and hence, you know, that's why it's become quite a crowded marketplace, which for buyers obviously can be a good thing.
Now, here's an interesting question. When it comes to transitioning, there's someone here who's having problems. He's deploying voice over IP systems, but it's got an image problem. It's because immediately you mention voice over IP to the people who are involved in paying for it, they immediately think they're going to make us all use Skype and turn off our phones. And he's saying, but how does he get past that? How can he convince people it's reliable and professional? James, did you come up against this prejudice?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, you know, there are a number of different approaches when taking on voice over IP as a customer. And yes, I think it has to start, and again, we'll go into this a bit more later, it has to start with what the requirements are, you know, of you know, your user base, in effect. And, you know, if they feel as if they're not going to get the quality of service that they're looking for, then obviously there is going to be a resistance there. There are solutions in the market, though, that actually work with traditional telephony as well. If you look at the VoIP gateway market, they're just translating SIP to analog. So in effect, you have this ability to ease the transition for the buyer, if you like.
I'm going to have to ask you to explain your jargon there.
Sorry. So SIP is the protocol that we use to, you know, transport voice over IP, and that is essentially used for trunks coming into the customer. So they'll come into the customer and they'll break out over analog phones. So effectively, that VoIP gateway is the translation device between the SIP world and your, you know, what you're used to at the desk, if you like.
Which touches on another one of the questions that I've got coming in here, where someone's asking, is it possible to put voice over IP into a small or a medium-sized business in a transparent way, so that people maybe don't even know that they've got voice over IP now?
From my opinion, yes, it's absolutely possible, because you can use your traditional analog handsets to do that, and you can gradually bring in your SIP handsets, your IP handsets, as and when you feel as if you're in a position to do so. You've got the support on those devices, and you've taught your users how to use them and become familiar with them. That's when it's effective. So, you know, that can, you know, that, so therefore you can, again, ease the transition for the buyer in that respect. So if you're picking up the phone, you should be getting exactly the same quality as if you were picking up a TDM handset.
Josie, do you have any opinion on whether this, you know, whether we should do the sort of like the big shock, you're all getting voice over IP today, or just sneak it in so that people don't notice?
I think you can do the big shock if you actually spend a little bit of time educating the people who are going to be using it, because if you don't, they're going to be faced with something that is completely alien to them. People have a tendency to, you know, when there's new technology in front of them, a lot of people will be completely turned off by it. So providing you educate people and you lead them through, then that's fine. My preference would be kind of a more gradual introduction to voice over IP, and literally have, you know, a voice over IP handset on your desk and a TDM handset on your desk, and actually run the two and let people get familiar, but educate them at the beginning and check that they're using functionality as you move, you know, through implementation. So a few weeks down the line, a few months down the line, and just continue the training, because if you don't, then that's where the problems will occur.
I mean, I hesitate to do this because we've got a bunch of questions coming in, but I mean, if any of you guys have had that experience, one of those two experiences, and you've got something that you've learned from it that you'd like to share with us, let us know, because we've got we've got some questions here from people saying, what are the practical problems that people who've installed it have experienced? If you've got something that you think might be useful, let us know on that, and then we can, and then we can give the voice of experience. In fact, we could all go home. We could just let you talk to each other. Sorry, before we go home, though, Josie, the rest of your presentation.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, so on the transitioning, what we're saying is obviously do the planning, very important, but also, you know, make sure that you know a lot about your supplier. Make sure they're up to the job. Again, very, very important. They've got to be the right person for, because there are lots of suppliers out there. Some obviously are better than others. Okay, this is a great slide, because what this is actually saying is, if you're taking the whole voice over IP package into account, about 2/3 of users think it's absolutely fantastic. Mm-hmm. You know, it's been a great move for them, and that's a great story to tell to people who are thinking about moving to voice over IP. It's you know, it goes a long way to reassuring them that actually it's actually been, you know, it's worth the journey. If you add in those people who like voice over IP, but felt that they would have been better with a different solution. So you've got a hybrid solution, but you feel you should have had hosted, you've got hosted, you probably should have had premise-based. Then you're talking about 4 in 5 of Reg readers who are actually very happy voice over IP users. So that is
4 in 5 Reg readers aren't particularly happy about almost anything.
They are
really.
Here,
so you know, that's
a positive.
It's not a bad result. Yeah,
result, absolutely. And there's only 1 in 10 thereabouts that really don't like it at all.
We've got a couple of them that have sent in questions though, so we'll keep those for James later on. But overall, that's at the end. You know, we normally get a slide like this, and it's got a smaller bright red area. So overall, we're saying that the industry is moving in the right direction. Yeah.
And I was quite surprised with this actually, but it's a great result nonetheless. Okay. So before kind of pass over to James, it's probably just worth recapping what we've talked about. When you're looking at going down the voice over IP road, you should expect it to deliver cost savings. Absolutely, that's a very strong story that's coming out, and you're going to get some functionality, some good functionality in there as well. You've certainly got a lot more choice in terms of you've got different types of solution available to you, and there are lots of suppliers out there in the market. And the stories are good, they're very positive stories, so take some reassurance from that. That said, if you are thinking about moving to voice over IP, make sure you go in with your eyes wide open. You know, there are potential issues with things like call quality, things that we've discussed already, and obviously make sure that you are taking your supplier along that journey with you. Make sure you're selecting a good supplier who can deliver and who will take you through the transition to voice over IP.
Well,
okay.
Thanks, Josie. Well, you know, luckily we have a supplier with us. James, are you going to take us through some of the practical things that we can do? If you want,
yes.
You can.
Thank you.
Turn the laptop so you can see it better, if you like.
Yeah. So I want to keep it simple today in terms of what should be considered when thinking about voice over IP for the first time. Going to the first slide. It is about cost savings. That is largely the driver for voice over IP these days, and that goes into, as I mentioned earlier, the BT line rentals, for instance, if you want to make savings there. In addition to that, What about the OPEX CAPEX ratio? Because depending on the type of solution that you want to deploy, you can either save CAPEX or OPEX, and again we can go into that in the slide after this. Okay. The second point is in relation to management and flexibility. I would have to say that voice over IP has been engineered, if you like, by many of the providers in the market to allow people to literally on the fly change the settings of their phone system, so your phone number can follow you wherever you are and such like. So in that respect, there is a built-in flexibility to voice over IP, if you like, that hitherto wasn't available on the PSTN network.
Some people will be thinking, well, it gives our IT department another job. We're always talking on these shows about how the IT department's overstretched already. They're going to have to take on more staff to manage this new application.
I'm going to trot out that familiar word, it depends, which is, it depends on the solution that you buy. If you want a fully managed solution, unfortunately you're going to have to pay for it. And that means, okay, you get rid of the IT cost, the networking cost within your own business organisation, but obviously you're paying a bit more for that. It just depends on where the expertise is. Do you have that? And are you still prepared to pay for it? Mm-hmm. So I suppose it's balancing, if you've got an IT department who's going to run it, how much are they compared to outsourcing it?
But tell me about the skills they're going to need. Do they have those skills already, or are they going to need retraining?
Well, if you're talking about an organisation, so a networking department, and obviously organisations will vary in size and therefore the expertise will vary as well. But typically people are trained in IP and they're running IP. Now, to transition over to SIP, yes, is a jump. Let's absolutely be frank, it is a jump, but it's still using the same core protocols. So it's not, it's not unmanageable, if you like, but you've got to invest the time in actually getting to grips with what you want to do and actually what level of expertise you need in order to deploy it properly.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, and as I mentioned, it is a feature-rich. So, when we talk about it now, we're referring to things for voice over IP such as interactive voice response and automated attendant. So, in effect, that plays into more sort of the call centre type arena, whereby you can effectively interact with the person calling using an automated system. So in effect, you can either keypad or voice recognition, if you like, for that purpose, and VoIP plays nicely into that because you can change the settings within that very easily using voice over IP, and equally voicemail, and that's obviously going to be more ubiquitous across organisations, whereby voicemail becomes part of that PBX type functionality, but in this case, IP PBX.
Just to feed in there, because some of the comments that came back from Reg readers centred around that it's great on flexibility, manageability, and there's some very, very positive stories that came back there. So it's that is important, absolutely.
Are most people using voice over IP at the moment to bring on new features, or are most people at the moment focused on, well, when Tony's sitting in your chair there, he always talks about doing more with less. What's the focus at the moment? Is it saving money or adding new features?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think probably cost savings, because we talked about cost savings.
They're dominating the agenda.
Yeah,
still.
because you see comms costs in businesses are going up. Phone usage costs are going up quite steeply in businesses. So the cost saving aspect is a big one, but it brings with it obviously the additional functionality. And as businesses kind of progress and advance, and there is need for more functionality and clever functionality.
James, what from your customers, most of your conversations dominated by the cost or the functions?
I mean, we're reasonably embryonic in the VoIP space at the moment in terms of a full solution. So what we've discovered up to this point is that it is cost that's driving it. There's no doubt about it. The features are nice to have, and they will become part of what they want to do in their everyday business. But generally, they want to save money in this climate as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So moving on to the next slide. So the how of deploying voice over IP. Now, Josie's alluded to these variants, if you like. I just thought I'd dwell on them very quickly to make sure we understand what they mean and maybe how they would fit into someone's requirements. So hosted is effectively a PBX in the cloud, for want of a better phrase. So in effect, you're hosting the voice solution out of a data center. So in effect, you don't have it within the confines of your own business.
So would that, for example, be your data center?
Yes, it could be.
You would have a data center, and that's where all their telephony comes from.
Yeah.
And it just comes down a pipe to their office.
Yeah.
Effectively.
Yeah. So it's built, therefore, on an OPEX model, and it goes back to, if you don't want to spend money on buying a PBX into the thousands of pounds and then maintain it, this is a lower cost option, effectively.
It's sort of pay by the month.
Yes.
By the quarter. Yeah.
Service. So the second option would be the sort of premise-based, as Josie talked about, where you're talking about the PBX on site. Quite a lot of popularity around that. I mean, Josie's research, brings out that in terms of the quality and seems to be that people are more pleased with that as a type of solution. But obviously, it comes with, you've got to keep the hardware refreshed. You've got to scale it with requirements and so on and so forth, and maintain it as well. So there's quite a bit involved, and perhaps you might want to do that in-house or use a maintainer. But maintainers can be quite pricey, so you've got to be sure as to whether it's right for you. Mm-hmm. And then the hybrid has quite a lot of connotations. The way I would look at it is, if it's a service provider involved in a hybrid, such as ourselves, then you're talking about hosting PBX both on-site and off-site potentially, using the service provider's network to connect the solutions, if you like. And I think that plays more into sort of the failover aspect of voice over IP. So if something goes down in the core, so then you can fail over to the other PBX potentially, because obviously it's a massive issue, the fact that if your calls go down, you want to have something there as a backup.
You haven't got a business if your calls go down.
Yeah.
Why do you think that the level of satisfaction with hybrid was less in Josie's slides?
I think it's more complicated to deploy, and therefore it's easier to get wrong. That's it. I think you're therefore, if you drop that into an organisation, and then what classic situation is, you get people leaving who are looking after it before, and then new people come in, and then they don't maintain it properly, and so on and so forth. That can be a real issue. So I would suggest it's the complicated nature of it that actually probably makes them come unstuck.
So someone sent a question in saying they got in touch with a voice over IP supplier, got a call back from one of their resellers. Now they trust the supplier. How do they know about the quality of the reseller? Do you use resellers?
Well, we are a reseller.
You're a reseller of somebody else, yeah. How do they know? How do they know about resellers at the moment? There's good and there's bad in everything, and it's something that's developing quickly like this. But
again, this will go into what I'm going to talk about in a few slides. But you're absolutely right. It's got to be about who's got the network, who's running that network, and how good is that network. That's what it's all about. And SLAs. Now, again, we service providers trot out these SLAs all the time, saying,
service level agreements.
Service level agreements. Thank you.
Up on your jargon
yes,
again. One more of those, you're in trouble.
So, from that perspective, it's very important to be able to give transparency to what the performance is going to be like.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, moving on to the next slide. So, who? This actually ties into that last point. So what criteria should you use in terms of deciding on a future provider? First of all, there's got to be a proof of rollout. So can you go to that provider and say, OK, tell me what you've done in the past. Give me some evidence that you can do what you say that you can do. Mm-hmm. The provider should have support on hand. Make that very clear that the actual lines of responsibility need to be drawn out very clearly in terms of, the supplier and what they're responsible for against what the customer's responsible for. Because as we know, it's a crowded marketplace. Everybody's got a slight variation on a theme, and so you need to be absolutely sure what you're looking at there.
What kind of level of support are we looking at there? From the, when it's your responsibility, what are you offering?
Well, to take for example, I mean, you can talk about the circuit start from the beginning. You talk about the circuit, which essentially carries the voice out of the site into the cloud. That's the first element that you need to be responsible for if you're offering a full package, if you like. So then you've got to have the uptime that's involved with that. On top of that, you've got to have the metrics that for the voice. So you work to service level agreements on those. And in addition to that, you've also got to have the fault response times, particularly for those service providers that aren't just providing a wires-only service, so they're providing the kit, the customer premise equipment at the end of the access connection, which is going to do possibly the translation, as we spoke about earlier. Who's going to be responsible for that? What are they going to do on it? And when are they going to be available to do it? All these questions need to be in the forefront of a buyer's mind. Transparent charging. Don't get caught out by suppliers looking to charge for extras. So what happens if, for instance, if you want to do a change, a configuration change in the middle of the life cycle of this service? Again, you need to have that focus on that. And strong SLA is what we've touched on already, and mostly you should be focusing on the voice quality and the uptime of circuits that are carrying that voice.
Can you guarantee the sort of uptime that traditional voice providers can guarantee?
Well, traditional voice again, if you duplicate your solution, then yes, you can. Definitely, but there's a cost attached to it. So then you've got to know where the crossover is. Can you still make cost savings on that, on that new VoIP solution if you're doubling up the capacity because you're running a failover between two circuits? That's the question that needs to be answered. So the answer is yes, but it will come at a cost.
Yeah, there's always that difference in expectation, isn't there, between the way a data network performs and the way a voice network has traditionally performed.
Absolutely, and this is really what, if you're thinking about VoIP, you need to take this into account. We've been spoiled for years and years with traditional telephony. So when you go over to voice over IP, you have to be aware of some of the issues that arise. You're running over a data network, you're running voice over it, and there's some kind of give and take to be had with that.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the final aspects is when. So when should an organisation deploy voice over IP? So, logically, at the end of a voice contract. So therefore, you're not penalised if you leave that voice contract too early. Mm-hmm. Potentially, that's one area that, or one timeline that needs to be kept in mind. The others are kind of joined together, those points. So, are you an organisation that has the capability in-house, or are you not? Do you need it, therefore, from another company, so from the supplier? And do they have, contractuals that will support, them doing everything for you, or otherwise you doing it? So it's very important for that organisation to actually look inwardly and determine, actually, how can we best do this with the resource that we've got inside our company? When's the best time to do it? Because it might dovetail in with other projects, on the IP networks, so that you can actually bring in expertise if you're doing other things with your networks, and bring in the voice over IP at the same time. So it's a real case of when you want to do that.
Do you think it's good to overlap? I mean, if you're talking about the end of a voice contract, it's a big risk if you finish your voice contract and then pick up the IPs more or less straight away.
Yeah, it could be. It could be a big issue, and to actually an extent, what we've found is that a lot of customers are interested in keeping ISDN 30s, if you like. So maybe they had 2, 3, 4 ISDN 30s. Maybe they want to go down to one ISDN 30, treat it as a backup circuit for that eventuality when your main voice over IP circuit goes down. So I definitely think that that's a requirement, or at least something that people need to bear in mind.
Mm-hmm. Could I actually add to that? Because I've had the experience of living through a voice over IP implementation at a previous workplace, where the day that IPT was turned on, the traditional analog system was turned off, and because the whole thing hadn't been provisioned properly, there hadn't been a proper assessment. As soon as it was switched on, we had no analog phones, the whole thing fell over, and it was just absolutely disastrous. It was unbelievable. And we ended up actually having to use mobile phones, so we couldn't get calls into the business, which was obviously not great. And in addition, we were having to use mobile phones and given we were an international business, we were making international calls with mobile phones and quite long calls. So the first year cost savings on that we were expecting with voice over IP just disappeared in a matter of days, essentially. And to boot, there was the image aspect of actually how we appeared to the outside world because people couldn't contact us. So that is really important. I would say you don't turn one off on the day that you turn the other on.
It's not a good look, is it? That we don't have any phones at the moment because we've just put on this.
And we didn't quite do it right, and our supplier didn't quite, didn't ask the right questions.
Yeah, there's someone's written in here. They've got a 10-year. So let's have a look and find it again. There's so many of these coming in now. Someone's got a 10-year-old PABX, and what they're thinking about is, do they upgrade that so that then they can sort of take that SIP feed in, translate it to analog? Is that worth doing, or is it worth chucking the thing out now and going straight to voice over IP?
Well, probably the first question to ask is, when's its end of life? So when do they have a problem getting parts and support on it? That's going to be key to that decision. Then they need to work out in terms of the running costs of that versus the running costs of voice over IP. I would go as far as to say that it's that simple. So very important, but at the same time, they will be used to a certain level of functionality that they want to get out of the VoIP solution. So again, the homework needs to be done in terms of how they can achieve that through a new solution, and can they do it at a cost that's actually going to benefit them.
You're really not going to have happy users if you ask them to expect less when you move over to voice over IP. That's not going to do anyone any favours, is it?
No.
Okay. Right.
Right, so just to summarise, again, cost is all important, but voice quality can't be drowned out by the noise of just wanting to get lower costs. It's absolutely imperative because businesses need telephony. There's no getting away from that. And secondly, legitimising the supplier is also absolutely crucial because you're entering into a partnership, for want of a better word, that is actually going to be, crucial to that business's, operations. So you've got to check out the supplier. You've got to make sure that they've got the credentials that you feel happy with to actually deploy that voice over IP. But more importantly, support that voice over IP solution.
Okay, these are my last. These are my 3 kind of top tips for voice over IP implementation. The first is you need to make sure you do a thorough review of your current comms infrastructure. Absolutely vital. And the pipe to the outside world, is it going to be able to handle voice over IP, or is it going to fall over? And if you can't do that by yourself, get the suppliers involved. And actually, that's a good checkpoint to see how competent those suppliers are, because they should be able to help you with that, and they can talk you through obviously the issues. And it's also going to help you determine the types of upgrades you might need if you want to go forward.
And I mean, at that level, if your supplier doesn't give you confidence, then it's the wrong supplier.
Then you walk. You obviously you need to look elsewhere. And of course, what I said earlier is, don't turn off your old system before you've tried and tested quite thoroughly the new system. You have to have, it has to be tested and it has to work. The second kind of top tip is understand your user base. And obviously, this is really about assessing their calling habits, their calling volumes, and what sort of features they're using now, what their expectations are now, and also what they're going to need in future. So that's obviously going to help define how you shape your solution going forward. And another really important aspect is the training. I mentioned this earlier, but users will need to be trained. They will need to be trained at the start, and then you'll need to do checkpoints along the way, because at the end of the day, if they're not comfortable using voice over IP solutions, they won't use it, and you're just losing all the goodness.
Well, I've got a question about that. There's one actually coming talking about this. Why do people need to be trained to use the telephone, Jose?
They don't need to be used to, trained to, well, they shouldn't need to be trained to use the telephone. But it's not just a telephone. There's obviously lots of other things you can do with your phone system. So if you're accessing your voicemail, if you're forwarding your number, if you are setting up conference calls, if you want to record calls, so it's training around those things. You know, there's lots of features that they may not be using, and even if the features already exist in the analog system that you have, you know, it's a good opportunity to see really how much people are using them and how much they should be using them, and get them actually, you know, trained up and kind of start as you mean to go on. So
James, you're nodding along with this one. Is this one of these things where, one of these technologies where people get shown it and then they don't use the stuff?
Yeah, I think you're right to an extent. I mean, I can take a very good example. That's when we got IP phones into our business, and then it was, you know, it was really a voyage of discovery, if you like, to incrementally over time become used to what it could do as you know, a simple IP phone. So yeah, it's absolutely crucial, and that's why you know, the supplier needs to be talking about these things with customers and saying, set some time aside and actually educate your people on how to get the best out of this voice over IP. Because at the end of the day, whoever's making that decision to buy voice over IP in that organisation is not only going to get a pat on the back for reducing the costs, but they're also going to get a really big pat on the back because everybody's happy with what they've done within the organisation.
Yeah. Josie, I've just got a quick question here. On your survey, someone's asked how many people were in the survey and what was the breakdown? If it doesn't matter, you know, you can't remember, we can tell them afterwards. There were quite a few, though, weren't there?
There were quite a few. It was in the kind of 600-700, I think, maybe more actually. It was about, I think it was about 600-700 in total. Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of the breakdown, I can get some information, but off the top of my head, I can't.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, if anyone needs to know, we can tell something afterwards. But you did have a full range here, which brings me to another question. Someone's saying, what's the minimum size of organisation for whom some voice over IP project is practical?
I think you could go down very small. I don't see why not. Even if it's just taking a public voice over IP service. I as an individual user, have used voice over IP when I've had to do a lot of international calling. I use a public service, true, but you know, for me it's a no-brainer. So. It depends on your calling profile. If you're doing a lot of long distance international callings, then really any size. It might affect your type of implementation. So you wouldn't probably want to go for a premise-based solution if you are a small company. Without a doubt, you'd probably be looking at a hosted solution. But that said, yeah, really down to any size, I would say.
Yeah.
James, how small do you go?
Well, I tend to agree. I mean, you know, we've been. You know, we've had customers that have been down in the sort of 1 to 10 user range, upwards, you know, 50 plus. So it really depends on, you know, what their requirements are. I mean, for those low number of users in there, then, you know, even if you're not talking about Skype, you can still deploy a VoIP gateway, SIP trunks very easily for, you know, below £1,000. So from that perspective, you know, then you know, it could be that there are quite a few different options out there for them.
We've got a couple of people coming in here with sort of questions. When they get it going, the frustrations they've had is when they get it going, that sometimes it works extremely well, and then in some environments it's not working well at all, and they're having trouble diagnosing and sorting out these problems. Some of these problems are going to be quite complicated, aren't they, James? It
is, because at the end of the day, you know, in the switch telephony world, it's quite simple. When you get into the IP world, then all of a sudden other things come to the fore, and that could, you know, we're starting to talk about security there as well. Mm-hmm. So that has an impact on, you know, the solution, and whether, you know, attacks are perpetrated and can, you know, slow traffic and so on and so forth, because, you know, they're using the same protocol. You know, your data and your voice is using the same IP. So that has to be borne in mind. And also, where are they connecting from? Because you can get soft clients now where you can come in from the internet onto an office LAN and do voice over IP. So again, what's it all about? At times of day, if you're using ADSL and it's a peak period and you haven't got what is known today as assured rate, it's going to be trouble. So from that perspective, it's very important to understand what you're trying to achieve, what you want to get out of it, and at the same time be able to monitor it. And that's another point altogether. Can you monitor it end to end to actually determine what the problems are in the first place?
I mean, it sounds like it might be useful to indulge in some kind of network optimization project before you go down this route, if you've got a network that would justify that, to avoid some of those problems first off. Is that something that...
Yeah.
Would you do that for them?
Well, yes. I mean, we're perfectly capable of doing that. I mean, it goes back to where do they want the access from? Are they, they've got lots of remote users? Do they want free intra-site calls between main offices? So the architecture and how you build it is probably the most crucial bit, and probably Josie agrees. The most crucial bit is understanding what they want to get out of in the beginning. Because if you badly scope it, it's and I'm not trying to put the worries into everybody, but you've got to be
worried already.
You've got to be. I'm being frank with just how. You've got to get to grips. It's just not something that you can drop in and leave. Now, a lot of the solutions out there at the moment are everyone's talking about, just drop it in and leave it. No, there's got to be a level of commitment there, and that's both installing and the ongoing support.
Okay. Sorry, Josie.
I think an important element in this, however, is the relationship you've got with your supplier and the competency of your supplier. If you've got a supplier who understands these issues and can help you through them, then you're going to be on a much better, start than if you've got a supplier who can't. So that underpins a lot of things, a lot of the success factors of VoIP.
A couple of people look into tomorrow's world now, and they're asking how practical voice over IP over wireless is as a technology to use around the office.
It's being experimented with, if you like, at the moment. It hasn't got a massive uptake because we still get issues. We're not deploying it at the moment. Purely because there are still some issues that need ironing out with it.
The issues being just that
the calls dropping out.
Calls drop.
And as long as that's a reality, then it's not going to be a mainstream option at the moment.
There's lots of talk about running your voice comms over your wireless network in the office, but again, I just think it's you've got to have a network that can deal with it for starters. So you've got to up the capacity of the network to begin with, and I think it's a consideration, but I'm not sure. I don't know.
So there's a couple of people here as well, James. They're talking about how they were thinking about voice over IP, but then of course their traditional phone suppliers convinced them that the technology is not quite there yet. You're competing with other voice over IP suppliers, but your biggest competition is what they've got already, isn't it?
Oh, it's much easier to stay what you're doing with what you've got at the moment. I absolutely agree, and it's just a natural human instinct, isn't it? So it goes back to the benefits, and it goes back to everything we've said today. At the end of the day, if the costs don't work out, then don't do it. We're not trying to sell something that isn't going to benefit the customer. It's got to benefit them, otherwise they don't actually do it properly, and they won't want to buy it, to be absolutely frank. So cost driven, and as long as it's done properly, it can really deliver a lot of different benefits and keep the bottom line cost down.
What's coming through your research though is that when the traditional phone suppliers are saying the technology isn't quite there yet, that reg readers are disagreeing with that now.
Absolutely, so it seems. So there's a lot of we did get a really positive response, and I was actually quite surprised. I thought it wouldn't be quite as strong, quite as positive in terms of the cost savings and the overall package of voice over IP. Take everything into account. It's a really positive story, and even the call quality issue, which is the biggest issue with voice over IP, it's seeming to go away a little bit. People are happier, and they know also that suppliers are actually addressing it, and they know that there are routes around it.
When you see different vendors, when you know Cisco and Nortel and everyone like that, piling in on voice over IP with more or less the same message, do you get the feeling they're providing more or less the same thing as well? Is there a big vendor differentiation on this? If we leave the resellers aside for a minute.
I don't know. There is, and I think it pays. It comes back to the point that it pays to do your homework. You know, it delivers a certain set of benefits, but there are pros and cons with each solution, with each supplier, and you really have to. It's horses for courses. You have to really decide what your business needs and see which suppliers can match that.
James, what do you think on that?
It's very competitive in that space. I mean, Cisco are doing a hell of a lot in terms of breaking ground with customers. So many organisations out there are very Cisco-led still, and you know they've done a good job. But you know, ultimately there are other solutions out there today that can compete with them at a lower cost. And you know, you don't have to look at Cisco if you don't want to. There are some reputable manufacturers out there of the same type of box that can actually beat them on price. So, you know, it's very easy, you know, if you've already got Cisco in place in your network, to just go out there and just buy a Cisco VoIP solution. Very easy indeed. But there are technologies out there, manufacturers out there at the moment that can integrate into that network today, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Cisco every time.
Okay, guys. Thanks very much. That's all we've got time for. So, and thanks very much for all your questions. We've got a ton of them here, and we will try. James, Josie, you will try, if there's any to pick up, to answer those. Although anyone that's sent in a question which really borders on technical support, I don't think we can do that for you. But thank you very much for coming along and watching our Regcast. Give it a rating. Tell us whether you enjoyed it or not and why. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you.